So, for today's movie review, I'll be reviewing Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, the sequel to the 2014 film Guardians of the Galaxy, and the overall 15th film in the Marvel Cinematic Universe franchise. And now that I'm sitting here reviewing this movie, I find it kind of odd that we're this far into the Cinematic Universe and we have, a group of obscure characters like this getting their own sequel. Because back when Phase 2 was announced, sure, we knew there was going to be another Iron Man film, another Captain America, another Thor film, and another Avengers film. But then, when Phase 2 was also announced, they also announced two new films, one of them being Ant-Man, which to most people were like, okay, I'm very curious how they're going to tackle Ant-Man in the context of this cinematic universe, but we're open to it. Then came Guardians of the Galaxy, and this had the most interesting reaction from both casual moviegoers and fans of the comics. Because on one hand, to a casual moviegoer, their primary reaction to the Guardians of the Galaxy was, who are the Guardians of the Galaxy? Whereas the Marvel fan base was like, really? We're getting a Guardians of the Galaxy movie before films like Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, or Black Panther? But sure enough, when Guardians of the Galaxy came out, it did very well, both box office wise, and both critics and moviegoers alike really liked the movie as well. So when Phase 3 came around with the announcement of there being a Volume 2, I'm gonna be honest, I didn't look forward to this one as much as the original, because with the original one, that one was so out there that it was completely different from what we've seen before, and there's several reasons as to why I didn't look forward to this one as much as the original. The first one being, looking at the trailers, they didn't really impress me as much as the first movie. And also, looking at the trailers, it just kind of looked like more of the same thing we saw in the first movie. Second, the original film gained such a huge following that it kind of pissed me off to some extent, because being a person who loved Marvel Comics, as I said earlier, when it came to these films being made, I was expecting, films like Ant-Man or Black Panther and Doctor Strange to get their own movies before anything like Guardians of the Galaxy, because they're B-tier superheroes, and Guardians of the Galaxy to me is very obscure. But the way people now and see it, they view Guardians of the Galaxy being like a B-tier comic book characters, while characters like Ant-Man, Doctor Strange, and Black Panther are treated as the obscure bunch. And this kind of pisses me off. It's kind of like when the first Iron Man film came out, when most of the casual moviegoers decided to read an Iron Man comic and go, who's that Alfred wannabe? It's kind of like that. And also, I don't necessarily like the influence of the original film as well, because when you look at a lot of the merchandise related to the Guardians of the Galaxy, there is indeed a lot of influence coming from the movies, from the TV show, the Tall Tale video game, even the comics that inspired Guardians of the Galaxy have more of the movie feels as opposed to what they looked like before the movie came out. But I ranted long enough. So, is Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2 a good movie? As for the plot of the film, set sometime after the events of the first movie, Peter Quill along with the rest of the Guardians have become well-renowned mercenaries throughout the galaxy, and after completing a dangerous mission involving an intergalactic beast, Peter Quill along with his crew get themselves into some shenanigans involving an intergalactic empire known as the Sovereign Empire. But as things look grim for the Guardians, they are soon rescued by this mysterious figure who claims to be Peter's father. And as Peter Quill has a family reunion with this mysterious figure who calls himself Ego, the rest of the team discovers that something's not quite right with Peter's father. And as that's going on, the Sovereign Empire joins forces with the Ravagers group to destroy the Guardians of the Galaxy. So, can the Guardians of the Galaxy figure out the mystery to Ego before they get annihilated by the Sovereign Empire and the Ravagers? In terms of what I liked about the movie is very entertaining to watch. Like, even when there's no action sequences going on, simply having the characters talk to one another is entertaining enough. The soundtrack, albeit not as memorable as the first movie soundtrack, it does its job of establishing mood for particular sequences. The makeup for various characters from the Ravagers, the Sovereign Empire, to a few of the Guardians of the Galaxy themselves look really great. And I actually like the fact that in a high-budget movie like this, I at least appreciate the fact that effects like these can still be used in this day and age, where everything's either done by computer-generated imagery or motion capture. I also like the fact that this movie has a lot more character development, because with the first movie, it had the daunting task of introducing 5 obscure combo characters to a general audience, and they had to give simplistic origins, which worked for that movie, but I think it had to sacrifice some character development in order for it to work. This time, however, since we're more familiar with the characters, there's a lot more character development. Like, I think the characters that benefit from the character development in this movie are Drax, because in the first movie, I said that he has a very compelling backstory, albeit we didn't really get to know him that much, and I felt that he didn't do much. But the more I watched that movie, he did slowly grow on me. In this film, however, he still got the same mannerisms, but he has a lot more material to work with. He actually does give some emotional scenes and a lot more funny material to play off of. Nebula this time around, I like the fact that we get to see what her relationship to Gamora is. I mean, yeah, we know that they're both sisters, but they go a bit further this time around. And I actually like the parts in the movie where she's talking about Thanos, because Thanos doesn't appear in this movie, but she does give a very disturbing story involving him. And it's kind of like a campfire story. It's just really disturbing and creepy to listen to. And I actually like the fact that even a character like Yondu gets more screen time here, because in the first movie, he appears periodically throughout the first movie, but he doesn't really do much. This time, however, he's given a lot more stuff to do. And I also like the fact that they include his mohawk, because one of my minor nitpicks was his mohawk wasn't big enough, but I like the fact that they finally given him his mohawk. And I also like the fact that he takes part in a lot more action sequences as opposed to the first movie. And I like the overall theme of the movie, which is family, because you got the ongoing stuff between, Gamora and Nebula, and you also have this stuff revolved around Peter trying to figure out his parentage with his father. I mean, granted, yeah, it's very much a nail on the head kind of theme, but it works well here. And speaking of Peter Quill's father, Ego is by far one of the better villains in the MCU, because in the past several Marvel movies, the villains have been very underwhelming in some regard. But with Ego, he's really entertaining, he's funny, and he's charming. And I actually like the fact that we have a main villain who in some relation is related to one of the main characters as a relative, because we've had characters who acted like father figures or characters who are adopted relatives, but here's a villain who is directly related to the main protagonist. And out of the villains featured so far, we have one that's a cosmic celestial being. We haven't seen that before in a Marvel movie up till now, and I find it to be very refreshing, actually. Even the idea of Ego having this human geist to interact with the characters, I thought was a really nice touch. Because if you know Ego from the comics, he is a literal living planet. And I actually do like the fact that they make reference to the actual face of Ego from the comics, but it's not used very much. So I do like the fact that we do have Ego interacting with the characters in human form. And speaking of the interaction between the villain and the heroes, I actually like the interaction this time around as opposed to the first movie, because with the first movie, when the heroes met Ronan, their conflict was very underwhelming because not much really happened. This time around, we actually have the characters battling the main villain, and it's entertaining. And there's one character depiction that greatly deviates from its comic book source, but for good reason, that being Mantis, because her comic counterpart is, she is this German Vietnamese woman who gets trained by some alien. She joins the Avengers for a bit, but then she goes onto space, and a lot of complicated, dumb shit occurs, and all of a sudden she's got green skin with antenna. So yeah, you can see why the filmmakers changed around the overall depiction of Mantis to work within the confines of this movie. Like, the her origin of this movie is, she was a alien who's been left behind and raised by Ego. Simple enough. And I do like the fact that James Gunn made Mantis another alien, because God knows that we have enough human characters in the MCU. And I do like the fact that they keep the idea of the green motif she has in the comics in the form of her dress, because her appearance in the recent incarnations of the Guardians of the Galaxy, she has green skin. And I think the reason why I'm okay with her not having green skin in the movie, we already have characters like Drax and Gamora who are already two characters that have green skin. I think it'd just be a bit too much if we have a third character who happens to have the same skin color, but I do like the fact that they keep the idea of the green motif in the form of her dress. Another aspect of the movie that I like was how the Sovereign Empire operates their spacecrafts, because they're not really spacecrafts, they're more like space drones. Because if I had to describe how the Sovereign Empire operates these machines, it's like how the US military operates aerial drones, but on a much larger scale. And that to me is both really cool to see in a movie like this and really refreshing. And the last thing that I liked about the movie is the fact that the original incarnation of the Guardians of the Galaxy makes an appearance in this movie, because if it wasn't wasn't for that original incarnation, we wouldn't have this current roster in which these two movies are based on. But the one thing that worries me is the fact that with the way the MCU is set up at the moment, there are a lot of characters, and I have no idea in terms of when or where this incarnation of the Guardians of the Galaxy are going to appear next. But if I had to make a guess, I have a feeling that they will probably appear within the confines of something like Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 3, if we get that far. In terms of what I disliked about the movie, even though the movie has a very good villain in the form of Ego, there are two other villains that I didn't mention because I think the movie necessarily needed to have these villains, those being the Sovereign Empire along with Taserface, because as far as the Sovereign Empire goes, I found them to be very forgettable. Like, you could have easily just have them stay within the first fourth of the movie and that would have been fine. And as far as Taserface goes, he's just a one-joke villain, which is, my name is Taserface, and yeah, there's really not much to him other than the fact that he's just a brute. And the pace into this movie isn't as well paced as it is with the first movies. With the first movie, there's a natural flow in terms of how we get from point A to point C, but as far as this movie goes, yes, the first fourth of the movie, it has a natural flow to it, but once Ego shows up in the picture, it feels like the movie goes kind of all over the place in terms of character focus, because we have one point in time focused on Rocket Raccoon joining forces with Yondu to fight against the Ravengers. This to me feels like it takes up like 20 minutes in the movie. Then we have another thing going on with Gamora battling Nebula. Then we have another point in time which is focused on Drax and Mantis doing something. Like, it feels clunky to some extent. But the thing is, all these events are tied together, which is why I think it works out in the end. So, on one hand, it's not bad. It's just doesn't flow as naturally as it did in the first movie. And this movie has a few plot holes in the context of the cinematic universe, because the main plan of Ego is that fact that he essentially wants to assimilate all the planets in the universe to share his likeness. And he does attempt to activate this plan, but there's a problem with it, because this film takes place a couple months after the events of the first movie, which means it takes place sometime before the events of Age of Ultron. And my problem with this is, by the time we get to the third Captain America movie, you have a scene where all the characters are talking about past events, and yet no one mentions the event in which Ego tried to cause. Now, granted, I get that when it comes to making this movies, not everything's gotta connect to one another, but the fact that with this plot hole, no one ever mentions it or brings it up is the problem. And another plot hole I just thought of was the cameo revolved around Stan Lee, because he's talking about events that happened in Civil War, but again, this movie takes place before then. So, yeah, there's an inconsistency to some of these plot holes, and I know a lot of people like Baby Groot in this movie. I think he's just fine, but he didn't really do much for me, and I feel like his purpose in this movie was to just be cute. That's it. I mean, he does a major thing at the climax, but beyond that, I feel like they could give him some more stuff to do, because he is just kind of the comical relief character. That's about it. He just didn't do anything for me. So for my final verdict of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, I'll admit, when I went to go see this film, I had some very low expectations, but after seeing it, I liked it a lot. Like, I think it's one of the few Marvel sequels to be just as good as its predecessor. Granted, I kind of prefer the original one in regards to the overall pacing and focus on one villain as opposed to three, but this one's really entertaining. So, overall, good movie. And before I give my final rating, what did everyone else have to say about Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2? Looks like a lot of people really liked this movie, and as did I. So for my final rating of Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, I give it 4 out of 5. So, what's your favorite cosmic element from the comics, and see you later.